Welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we tackle a single relevant question from our Bible reading that day. This week our reading is centered around the book of John. Today I'm joined by Jay Rivenbark and Chris Rexroad, and we're going to dive into a question from our reading today in the book of John. But since it's Monday, let me tell you what the theme of the book of John is. It is the Son of God. That is what he speaks of. He focuses on Jesus' identity as God and man. He's presented as the Son of God. You know, he begins by, which would have been, is not our reading today, talking about how Jesus was the Word, became flesh, dwelt among us. But he still had divine power and authority. You know, he talks about love, forgiveness. And as a matter of fact, John, when people are new converts or they have not read their Bible a lot, most of the time, this is the book that I send them to first. This is the book of John. So our reading today was John chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. And this is the story of Jesus turning water into wine. And we were just I saw a TikTok, and I've seen many different variations of this, but this one was funny to me. This woman ran into her pastor coming out of the grocery store, and he had a bottle of wine under his arm, and he's trying to hide it. And she runs into him and "Hey, pastor, how you doing?" And he's like, "I'm doing fine," you know, and he's squirming with the bottle of wine. And she's like, "What are you doing?" He said, "I just had to pick up a couple of things." And she said, "Well, what did you get?" And he said, "Well, I really just needed water." And she looked around there and he's got wine. She said, "That ain't water." And he said, "Lord, he has done it again." He has done it again.
Yep.
And of course, I've seen the first one I ever saw was in Walmart. Somebody I guess in the merchandising part, hadn't changed the signs when they changed the location of the items, and they had a wine where the water sign was, and they said Jesus has been shopping at Walmart. But having come from a relatively conservative church background, I have heard a lot of arguments about this particular passage, about whether it was actually wine or whether it was juice, you know, whether it was new wine, you know, and what does new wine mean? Fundamentalists today still take that stand that it was not alcoholic drink that he made. So the question that I want to ask about this is, why do people argue over whether it was grape juice or fermented wine? Why is that an argument?
Well, I'd say the argument since the 1800s and 1900s was groups of people that started the, was it temperance? Is that what it's called? Temperance movement? Basically encouraging people to abstain from alcohol and tobacco and a lot of other things. And it rolled into, I believe it was actually, was it Welch's? T.B. Welch. I think that he actually pasteurized grape juice and kept it from going to a fermenting process because his mom was a strong believer in that. And that was something that he offered up to the churches. And then we roll into the 1900s, you know, here in the U.S. with prohibition and everything. So there was this like long-term negative outlook on specifically alcohol. I think that played a large role in the way that people think about it and how it affected the Protestant churches specifically.
You know, I think a lot of it has to do, well, first of all, I would say primarily probably the way you were raised and what you were taught as it relates to alcohol. You know, we have in years past addressed that issue from a scriptural standpoint about alcohol / drunkenness, the difference of those, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't even think when we read scripture that we understand culturally the difference in wine and other beverages. You know, I've had opportunity to travel some And there's some places you go, and that's just as common as it is a glass of tea here, or
More common.
or you're right, or more common, where it's just absolute a part of the culture. And I was raised in a background where the mere thought or even saying alcohol probably was considered a sin, and so therefore, in order to fit that into their way of thinking, their theology, then the only real solution that was to say it's non-alcoholic.
And I grew up in the Catholic Church, so once I went through communion and reconciliation, I was actually able to go up and have a sip of wine when we got the Eucharist and the wine. And at first, when you're that age and you get to do that, you're really excited until you taste it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just awful.
Yeah, it is very cultural, and it's not even denominational as much as it is cultural. And I'll give you an example. So I grew up in a very teetotal atmosphere. The church that I grew up in, the church environment, taught abstinence, total abstinence of any alcohol. And people will ask me from time to time, is it okay to drink alcohol? And, we've talked about it on here. We've preached about it. But the older I get, the more caveats I put on that. In that, I've never seen anybody solve a problem because they were drunk. Nobody drank their way to a better marriage, a better job, a better life. It just didn't happen. But I grew up in a traditional Pentecostal, the Church of God is what I grew up in. Very much like the Assemblies of God, Pentecostal holiness. Between those three, there's not 50-cent difference, or at least there hasn't been historically. But in 2012, preached, I didn't preach. I was teaching. I did preach, but I was teaching in Germany for Equip, John Maxwell's leader. I was teaching John's leadership information there. And the people overseeing it were Assemblies of God. The country coordinator and whatever was Assemblies of God. And they were my host. And so after we had the first night, they took us all out to dinner. And they ordered beer for the entire table. And I was like, what? Like, what is this? Like, even then, so I'm 45. It still was a shock to me. And I said, I got to be honest with you. I never thought I would be in a gathering where the Assembly of God, he was the overseer for the whole country, ordered beer for the entire table. Now, that was a cultural thing because that's what you drink. You drink a beer just like you would drink a glass of water, or you didn't get drunk. You didn't drink to get drunk. You drank it as with your meal, it accompanied your meal and all the meals. That was everywhere we went. That was what you got. They looked at you strange if you ordered water. In South America, wine was much more prevalent. That they would drink it. And of course, I didn't drink water. I drank water most of the time, but I wouldn't drink water there, not unless it was bottled water, because it's just trying to protect myself. Which is some of when you get to the New Testament, what Paul says to Timothy there about for your stomach's sake, mostly protection.
Yeah, and he makes it very clear in that passage. You can go back and read it. He said, "Don't just drink water."
Right.
There's a distinction as to whether it is alcoholic or not. Drinks a little wine for your stomach's sake. He said that's some medicinal, issues here and benefits from it.
And Venezuela was the first place I'd ever had actual wine for communion, because we were, I wasn't aware of the Welch's, but I was raised on it.
Yeah. I think it was like late 1800s that he developed that, and it really become a big push in the early 1900s.
And so, but they would do Dixie cups with, it was half 7-Up, half wine, like a spritzer. But they were full. Like, you could sip on it the whole service, but that ain't what they wanted you to do. They wanted you to toss it back.
Communion
Take a
shots.
I know. I was,
Communion
and I
shot.
joked at them because I'm not a drinker, but I joked at them. I said, because they had 4 services. I was preaching all 4 services. I said, I ain't sure what the last service is going to be like if I take communion every service. Yeah. I want to see the video. But it is much more cultural. And I've heard, particularly in recent years, the fundamental church talk about this passage and a couple of others, where they jump through some real hoops to try to get to, it won't, it won't fermented wine, new wine. No, I don't think so. I don't think that. I don't think that's what it's saying. I think it's a silly argument to have.
Yeah.
It is what Paul would write to Timothy about profane and useless arguments to get into. That why do we want to have this? The Bible is clear. Don't get drunk. That you can't deviate from that. You can't argue about that. That's as black and white. It's as black and white as pretty much anything else in Scripture. Don't get drunk. The alcohol thing is this. It's one of those things. There has to be some liberty, and if we bury ourselves, what happens, in my opinion, when we try to make arguments that really aren't tenable, is we lose credibility about the stuff that does matter.
Yeah.
And have y'all ever heard anybody try to hoop through this?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah. That was the norm for me growing up. It was explained away or why it wasn't.
New wine was grape juice, but that's not the way. Do y'all read that in when you look at the definitions of the word? Is that what you find?
That it wasn't?
Right.
No.
Yeah.
No. I mean, and this one right here, I mean, when you go back, you look at different versions and you go back to the translation in Greek and Hebrew, and it constantly comes back as wine, not juice.
Yeah.
And looking at the culture, looking what they did during celebrations, what we still do today, I couldn't imagine it being grape juice. I mean, everything would point towards wine, which to me is no big deal. I mean, that just seems like it makes sense.
And it's much more of a miracle, right?
Sure.
It's not a miracle to make water take like grape juice. Kool-Aid been doing that forever.
Yeah.
It is a miracle for it to be fermented and have content that would change
it's
people's behavior.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think in this context right here, I don't think the guy would have called him over to tell him that you brought out the best grape juice after they'd had wine. He'd probably be like, what is this? Why did you bring this out?
Right. Anything else y'all want to add to this passage before we...
Can I throw a real quick story in?
Yeah.
Several years ago, it was on a Sunday. I was going home, and in the town I lived in, you couldn't buy alcohol, till a certain time.
Right.
And I wasn't buying alcohol, haven't bought alcohol, but I stopped in because my wife had been out of town for 2 or 3 days, and I don't even remember if it was birthday, anniversary, but there was some event coming up, and so I thought, you know what, I'm going to show her I was thinking about her, and I stopped at the local grocery store to get a bottle of Welch's sparkling grape juice, and I brought it up front, and I felt ashamed even with that.
Right.
I didn't want anybody to see me. I ran in there, I grabbed it real quick and went up, and then the girl, when I got up there, she said, sir, you can't buy that till whatever time. I think it was 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, whatever. She said, you can't buy that. I said, why? She said, because we don't sell alcohol. I said, it's not alcohol. I said, look, and before I could even reason with her, she leaned into the speaker. She said, manager, please. The man's trying to buy alcohol up front, trying to buy. I'm just like, I'm out of here. I'm gone. It's like,
all the spotlight.
Dear Heavenly Father, dear Lord, please let there have been a security camera somewhere that I can review this.
I'm telling you, and I was so guilt-ridden and ashamed, and I had done nothing wrong. You know what I'm saying? I couldn't even get my sparkling grape juice, to have for later because what I had grown up in and the connotation to it, you know what I'm saying? It just had such a stigma to it.
Yeah. That's hilarious. Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue our conversation around the book of John.